There's a phase in psychological development that feels almost confusing when it first appears, because it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like something is being taken away. Earlier in your journey, growth had a very different quality. It felt expansive. You became more aware, more stable, more capable of seeing patterns in yourself and others. Carl Jung described this stage as the strengthening of consciousness. The ego becomes more differentiated from the unconscious. You begin to recognize projections. You begin to observe rather than react. And with that awareness came a certain intensity, a sense of movement, a feeling that you were becoming more clear, more insightful, more developed. But if the process continues, if individuation deepens beyond this phase, something unexpected begins to happen. The intensity softens. The need to assert your understanding fades. The desire to be right becomes less compelling. And at first, this can feel like a loss, because the part of you that was energized by growth begins to quiet down. You may notice this in very ordinary moments. You're in a conversation where someone misunderstands something you said. Earlier in your development, you would have clarified, explained, refined your point, not out of insecurity, but out of a desire for accuracy. Now, something different happens. You pause. You feel no urgency to correct them, not because you become passive, but because the need to be understood no longer carries the same psychological weight. Carl Jung believed that as individuation progresses, the ego gradually loses its compulsion to assert itself as the center of meaning. It becomes less invested in controlling how reality is interpreted. And this shift can feel disorienting, because for a long time, growth felt like gaining clarity. Now it begins to feel like releasing control. Let's take another example. You notice someone behaving in a way that you clearly recognize as projection. Earlier, this would have activated your awareness. You would have internally identified the pattern, perhaps even felt the impulse to point out or analyze it. There was a subtle engagement with the dynamic. Now you still see it. The perception hasn't disappeared, but the psychological reaction has changed. You observe it and let it pass. There is no need to intervene. No need to position yourself as the one who understands. No need to internally elevate your awareness in contrast to their unconsciousness. And this is where something important becomes visible. Awareness remains, but identification with awareness begins to dissolve. Carl Jung warned that earlier stages of growth often carry the risk of inflation precisely because awareness becomes part of identity. But at deeper stages, that identity begins to loosen, not because you reject awareness, but because you no longer need to be the one who is aware. And this creates a very different internal experience. You become quieter, not externally, internally. The constant evaluation of situations decreases. The need to interpret everything softens. You stop organizing your experience around what you understand, and instead, you begin allowing experience to exist without immediate meaning. Jung often emphasized that the psyche is not something to be dominated by interpretation alone. It must also be lived, experienced, and allowed to unfold without premature conclusions. This is where humility begins to emerge. But it doesn't feel like humility in the conventional sense. It doesn't feel like lowering yourself. It feels like returning to proportion. You begin to sense how much of reality remains outside your control, how much of the psyche remains unknown, how much of human behavior cannot be fully reduced to explanation. And this recognition does something subtle but powerful. It reduces the psychological need to elevate yourself through understanding. You may notice this shift when reflecting on your own past growth. There was a time when becoming more aware felt like becoming more defined. You could describe yourself more clearly. You understood your patterns. You had language for your experiences, and that clarity felt stabilizing. But now, something changes. You begin to see that every explanation you have about yourself is still incomplete. Carl Jung insisted that the self, the totality of the psyche, can never be fully contained by the ego's understanding, which means no matter how much you understand yourself, you are always more than that understanding. And when this realization becomes real, not intellectual, but experiential, it alters your entire relationship to growth. You are no longer trying to find yourself through awareness. You are no longer trying to stabilize your identity through insight. You begin to feel something that is difficult to describe at first, a kind of psychological lightness. You don't need to prove your awareness. You don't need to demonstrate your understanding. You don't even need to internally confirm it, because the need itself has softened. Let's bring this into another real-life situation. You are listening to someone speak about a problem they don't fully understand. You recognize the underlying dynamics immediately. You could explain it. You could break it down. You could offer a clear psychological interpretation. But instead, you listen fully, without preparing your response, without organizing their experience into categories, without positioning yourself as the one who sees more clearly. And something surprising happens. Your presence becomes more grounded, more available, more real. Carl Jung believed that true psychological maturity is not expressed through interpretation alone, but through presence, the ability to be with what is without needing to reshape it through the ego. And this is where growth begins to feel quieter, not because it has weakened, but because it has stabilized. Earlier, growth required effort, attention, engagement. Now it becomes integrated. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need to assert itself. It simply exists. And this can feel almost like a reduction of self, because the parts of you that once defined your progress, your insight, your clarity, your awareness, no longer need to be emphasized. Carl Jung described this as a movement towards psychological proportion. The ego no longer expands beyond its proper place. It finds its correct relationship to the self, not dominant, not inflated, but aligned. And this alignment changes how growth feels. It is no longer dramatic. It is no longer intense. It becomes steady, grounded, almost invisible. You may even question it. You may wonder if you're still progressing, because it no longer feels like becoming more. It feels like needing less validation, less comparison, less explanation, less control. And that is precisely why the stage is so often misunderstood, because it does not resemble what we typically associate with growth. It does not look like expansion. It looks like simplification. But Jung would say that this is not regression. It is integration, because what has been developed no longer needs to be asserted. It has been absorbed. And what remains is not a stronger ego, but a quieter one that no longer needs to stand above others to feel stable, one that no longer builds identity around awareness, one that no longer seeks confirmation through understanding. And in that quiet, something more accurate begins to emerge, not a smaller self, but a more proportionate one. A deeper understanding of this stage begins when you examine not just the experience of becoming quieter, but the psychological mechanism behind it, because this shift is not accidental. It is structural. Carl Jung made a distinction that becomes crucial here: the difference between ego-centered awareness and self-oriented awareness. In earlier stages of growth, awareness is still closely tied to the ego. You become more conscious, but the ego remains the center of that consciousness. It observes, it interprets, it understands. And because of this, awareness often feels like an expansion of the self. You feel more capable, more perceptive, more developed. Jung acknowledged that this phase is necessary. The ego must first become strong enough to differentiate itself from the unconscious. Without that differentiation, there is no stable ground for individuation. But Jung also warned that this stage carries a built-in illusion, the illusion that awareness belongs to the ego, that you are the one producing insight, that you are the one becoming more conscious. And this illusion creates a subtle inflation, not because the awareness is false, but because its ownership is misinterpreted. As individuation deepens, something begins to correct this misunderstanding. You start to notice that awareness does not feel like something you control. It feels like something that appears. Insights arise, realizations emerge, understanding unfolds, but not always through effort, not always through intention. Carl Jung emphasized that much of what we call awareness is actually the result of interaction between the ego and the unconscious. It is not created by the ego alone. It is revealed through a relationship. And when this becomes clear, not intellectually but experientially, the entire structure of identity begins to shift. Because if awareness is not entirely yours, then what are you? This question destabilizes the ego in a very specific way, not by weakening it, but by putting it back into proportion. You begin to sense that your role is not to be awareness, but to participate in it. And that participation requires a different posture, less control, less ownership, less identification. Carl Jung described this as the ego entering into proper alignment with the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, is not the ego. It is the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. And when awareness begins to orient toward the self rather than the ego, something remarkable happens. The ego stops expanding because it no longer needs to. It no longer has to define itself through what it understands. It no longer has to stabilize itself through comparison. It no longer has to build identity around insight. Instead, it becomes functional, grounded, proportionate. Let's bring this into a real situation. You are in a conversation where someone expresses a perspective that you previously would have analyzed. You would have broken it down psychologically, identified underlying dynamics, perhaps even mentally categorized their behavior. But now, something interrupts that process. Not forcefully, quietly. You notice that your impulse to interpret is still there, but it feels unnecessary. You can see the pattern, but you don't need to define it. Carl Jung would say that this is a shift from interpretive dominance to psychological participation. You are no longer trying to master the situation through understanding. You are allowing the situation to exist without reducing it. And this changes your internal experience. There is less mental movement, less need to organize, less need to conclude. And this is where humility begins to deepen, not as an idea, but as a direct consequence of how awareness is now functioning. Because the more you recognize that awareness is not fully yours, the less you can use it to elevate yourself. The more you see that insight emerges from something larger than your ego, the less you feel inclined to claim it as personal achievement. Carl Jung warned that one of the greatest dangers in psychological development is the ego identifying with the self. When this happens, the ego mistakes the depth of the psyche for its own depth. It begins to believe that it possesses qualities that actually belong to the larger structure of the psyche. And this is what creates inflation. But when that identification loosens, inflation naturally dissolves, not through effort, not through suppression, but through recognition. You begin to see that what you once experienced as your awareness is actually part of a much larger process. And this realization has consequences. You become less certain, not confused, but open. You become less invested in being right, not indifferent, but flexible. You become less focused on interpreting others, not disengaged, but present, because the need to assert your awareness has faded. And this brings us to an important psychological distinction Jung made: the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge seeks to define, to categorize, to explain. Wisdom, in contrast, recognizes the limits of definition. It understands that every explanation is partial, that every interpretation reduces something that is inherently complex. As individuation deepens, awareness begins to shift from knowledge toward wisdom. And with that shift, the ego loses one of its primary functions, the need to establish certainty. This is why growth begins to feel quieter, because certainty is loud. It organizes, it declares, it concludes, but wisdom does something else. It observes, it allows, it remains open. Carl Jung often emphasized that the psyche cannot be fully grasped through rational understanding alone. It must be approached symbolically, experientially, with a tolerance for ambiguity. And this tolerance is what reduces the ego, because the ego prefers clarity, it prefers control, it prefers definition. But when you begin to accept that not everything can be fully understood, the ego relaxes. It no longer needs to dominate your experience. It no longer needs to assert meaning at every moment. And this is where a deeper form of stability emerges, not the stability of certainty, but the stability of openness. You may notice this in subtle behavioral changes. You listen more, without preparing your response. You observe more, without immediately interpreting. You speak less, but when you do, it is more precise. more grounded, less driven by the need to be recognized as insightful. Carl Jung believed that this is a sign of true psychological maturation, not the accumulation of insight, but the refinement of how insight is held. Because insight, when held too tightly, becomes identity, and identity becomes limitation. But insight, when held lightly, remains alive, flexible, open to revision, open to expansion, open to contradiction. And this is where humility stabilizes, not as something you try to practice, but as something that naturally emerges when the ego is no longer inflated by awareness. You no longer feel the need to be more conscious, because you understand that consciousness itself is not something you own. It is something you participate in. Carl Jung's work consistently points to this final shift, from ownership of awareness to relationship with awareness. And in that relationship, the ego finds its proper place, not diminished, not erased, but balanced, no longer expanding beyond its limits, and no longer shrinking out of insecurity, simply aligned. And that alignment is what makes true humility possible, not as weakness, but as accuracy. What begins to define the stage of development is not what you understand, but what you no longer need to prove, because something fundamental has shifted. Earlier in your growth, awareness naturally expressed itself outwardly. You spoke about insights. You noticed patterns. You engage with psychological dynamics actively. Carl Jung described this as a necessary phase where consciousness differentiates itself and begins organizing experience through understanding. The ego, at this stage, still plays a central role in structuring meaning. And because of that, awareness often carried a subtle visibility, not necessarily performative, but present. You felt your development. You noticed your clarity. You were aware that you were aware. But as individuation deepens, that reflex begins to dissolve, not because awareness disappears, but because the need to recognize yourself as aware fades. And this changes how you move through the world in ways that are easy to overlook. You may notice it in conversation. Someone expresses an opinion that you understand is incomplete. Earlier, you might have refined it, expanded it, offered a more accurate perspective, not to dominate, but to bring clarity. Now, something different happens. You allow the limitation to exist, not out of indifference, but out of proportion. Carl Jung emphasized that not every truth needs to be spoken, and not every insight needs to be asserted. The psyche develops not only through expression, but through restraint. And this restraint is not suppression. It is alignment. You are no longer driven by the need to bring every unconscious dynamic into the light immediately, because you recognize something deeper. Awareness cannot be forced into others. It must emerge, just as it did in you. This realization changes your relationship to influence. You stop trying to elevate conversations. You stop trying to guide every interaction toward insight. You stop positioning yourself, even subtly, as the one who sees more clearly. And with that, something else disappears. The need to be perceived as someone who has evolved. This is one of the most important transitions in advanced individuation, because earlier, even without realizing it, part of your identity may have been supported by that perception. You were the one who understood, the one who reflected, the one who saw patterns. And even if you never expressed it outwardly, it existed internally. It shaped how you related to others. It gave your growth a certain form. But now, that structure becomes unnecessary. You no longer need others to recognize your awareness. You no longer need to confirm it to yourself. You no longer need to stabilize your identity through it. Carl Jung warned that the ego will always attempt to secure itself through some form of identification. But at deeper stages of development, those identifications begin to dissolve. Not because they're rejected, but because they are no longer required. And when that happens, behavior changes in subtle but profound ways. You begin to speak less, but with more weight. You begin to listen more, without preparing responses. You begin to engage, without trying to shape outcomes. There is a simplicity that emerges, not a lack of depth, but a lack of unnecessary movement. Let's consider a familiar situation. Someone misunderstands you. They interpret your words in a way that does not reflect your intention. Earlier in your development, you would have clarified, adjusted, ensured that you were accurately understood. Now, you may simply let it pass, not because you don't care, but because being understood is no longer central to your psychological stability. Carl Jung believed that as the ego comes into proper relationship with the self, it becomes less dependent on external confirmation. It does not need to control perception. It does not need to manage interpretation. It remains grounded regardless of how it is seen. And this creates a form of strength that is almost invisible because it does not assert itself. It does not defend itself unnecessarily. It does not seek reinforcement. It simply remains. You may also notice this shift in how you relate to disagreement. Earlier, disagreement may have activated your awareness. You would analyze the other person's position, identify inconsistencies, offer more refined understanding. Now, you may find yourself less compelled to do so, not because you lack clarity, but because you no longer need to resolve every difference. You can hold multiple perspectives without needing to collapse them into a single interpretation. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological maturity includes the ability to tolerate ambiguity, to allow opposing truths to coexist without forcing resolution. And this tolerance reduces the ego's need to dominate through understanding. You begin to see that not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every dynamic needs analysis. Not every situation requires your awareness to intervene. And this realization brings a kind of internal stillness, because much of what once created movement no longer does. You are not pulled into every opportunity to demonstrate insight. You are not compelled to organize every experience into meaning. You are not driven to position yourself within every interaction. And in that absence of compulsion, something becomes clear. You are no longer building yourself through awareness. You are living with it. Carl Jung believed that individuation ultimately leads to a state where the ego becomes a participant rather than a controller. It does not disappear. It functions. It responds. But it does not dominate the psyche. And this is what allows humility to stabilize fully, not as something you practice, but as something that naturally exists when the ego is no longer inflating itself through identity. You begin to feel less defined, but more real, less structured, but more stable, less concerned with who you are, but more aligned with how you exist. And this can feel unfamiliar at first, because so much of earlier growth was about becoming something. Now, it is about no longer needing to become. Carl Jung pointed toward this paradox repeatedly. The more individuated a person becomes, the less they are concerned with being anything in particular, because they are no longer constructing themselves through identity. They are allowing the psyche to express itself without interference. And this is what gives rise to what many would call quiet strength, not visible dominance, not intellectual authority, but grounded presence, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that does not need to be recognized, the kind that does not compare, because it is no longer operating within that structure. And this is where growth completes a certain cycle, not by reaching a final point, but by releasing the need for one. You are no longer trying to be more aware. You are no longer trying to be more evolved. You are no longer trying to be anything beyond what is present. And paradoxically, this is where the deepest form of psychological maturity begins, because nothing extra is being added. Nothing is being performed. Nothing is being protected. What remains is simple, accurate, and grounded in something that does not need to prove itself. Carl Jung believed that this is the closest the ego comes to its proper place, not inflated, not diminished, but aligned. And from that alignment, something rare becomes possible, a life that is no longer organized around becoming, but around being. There's a quiet realization that marks the transition into real psychological maturity. It does not arrive with intensity. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels almost ordinary, and yet it changes everything. You begin to notice that the drive to become more has softened, not disappeared completely, but lost its urgency. Earlier in your journey, growth felt directional. You were moving towards something. More awareness, more clarity, more integration. Carl Jung described this movement as a necessary unfolding of consciousness. The ego differentiates itself, confronts the shadow, and gradually aligns with deeper structures of the psyche. And in that process, there's effort, engagement, transformation. But Jung also pointed towards something that appears later, something far less discussed. A stage where growth stops feeling like movement and begins to feel like balance. You are no longer chasing awareness. You are no longer measuring yourself against unconsciousness. You are no longer trying to become someone who has arrived, because something becomes undeniably clear. There's no final version of you. Carl Jung emphasized that the self, the totality of the psyche, is not something the ego can fully realize or complete. It is something that unfolds across a lifetime, which means the idea of arriving was always incomplete. And once that realization settles in, not intellectually, but deeply, something relaxes. You no longer need to build yourself through growth. You no longer need to confirm your development. You no longer need to compare your awareness to others. And this is where humility stabilizes completely, not as effort, not as restraint, but as accuracy. You begin to see yourself more proportionately, not smaller, but not inflated. You recognize your awareness without identifying with it. You recognize your limitations without being defined by them. Carl Jung believed that this is what psychological balance truly looks like. The ego is no longer trying to dominate the psyche, but it is also no longer dissolving into uncertainty. It stands in the middle, in relationship with the self. And from that position, something changes in how you experience life. You become less interested in being right, not because truth no longer matters, but because your identity is no longer tied to it. You become less concerned with how you are perceived, not because perception is irrelevant, but because it no longer stabilizes your sense of self. You become less reactive to misunderstanding, less invested in correcting others, less compelled to demonstrate insight, and in place of all that, something quieter emerges, a grounded presence, a kind of psychological steadiness that does not depend on constant confirmation. Carl Jung often suggested that true individuation makes a person more human, not less, more connected to the complexity of life, more tolerant of ambiguity, more capable of holding contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately. And this is why real growth begins to look understated. From the outside, it may not appear impressive. There is no need to display it, no urgency to express it, no desire to prove it. But internally, it is deeply stable, because it is no longer built on identity. It is built on relationship, a relationship with the psyche that remains open, flexible, ongoing. You begin to trust something you didn't trust before, that not knowing is not a weakness, that uncertainty is not a failure, that incompleteness is not something to fix, but something to live with. Carl Jung understood that the more conscious a person becomes, the more they recognize the limits of their own consciousness. And this recognition does not diminish them. It grounds them, because it removes the illusion of control, the illusion of final understanding, the illusion of superiority. And what remains is something far more sustainable, a way of being that does not depend on being more than others, or even more than yourself. Before you leave, consider this carefully, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. Does your growth still feel like something you need to prove, or has it become something you simply live? There's no right answer, only honesty, and that honesty is where real individuation continues. If you've reached a point where your growth feels quieter, less performative, less defined by comparison, share that experience, not as advice, not as authority, just as a moment you've noticed within yourself, because someone else may be standing exactly where you once were. Believing growth must feel like expansion, when in reality, it may be inviting them into something much deeper. And if this perspective shifted how you see your own development, stay with this work, not to become more, but to remain aligned with something that does not need to become anything at all. Because, as Carl Jung revealed through his life's work, wholeness is not achieved by adding more to yourself, but by no longer needing to